Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Religion, Revealed Religion, continued. In the company of Dali. When spirit is at first conceived of as substance in the element of pure thought, it is immediately simple and self-identical eternal essence, which does not, however, have this abstract meaning of essence, but the meaning of absolute spirit. Only spirit is not a meaning, is not what is inner, but what is actual. Therefore, simple eternal essence would be spirit only as a form of empty words if we went no further than the idea expressed in the phrase simple eternal essence. But simple essence, because it is an abstraction, is in fact the negative in its own self, and moreover, the negativity of thought, or negativity as it is in itself, in essence. That is, simple essence is absolute difference from itself, or its pure othering of itself. As essence, it is only in itself, or for us, but since this purity is just abstraction, or negativity, it is for itself, or is the self, the notion. It is thus objective, and since picture thinking interprets and expresses as a happening what has just been expressed as a necessity of the notion, it is said that the eternal being begets for itself another, but in this otherness it has at the same time immediately returned into itself, for the difference is the difference in itself. That is, it is immediately distinguished only from itself, and is thus the unity that has returned into itself. There were three distinct moments: essence, being for self, which is the otherness of essence and for which essence is, and being for self, or the knowledge of itself in the other. Essence beholds only its own self in its being for self. In this externalization of itself, it stays only with itself. The being for self that shuts itself out from essence is essence knowledge of its own self. It is the word which, when uttered, leaves behind, externalized and emptied, him who uttered it, but which is immediately heard, and only this hearing of its own self is the existence of the word. Thus the distinctions made are immediately resolved as soon as they are made, and are made as soon as they are resolved, and what is true and actual is precisely the immanent circular movement. This immanent movement proclaims the absolute being as spirit. Absolute being that is not grasped as spirit is merely the abstract void, just as spirit that is not grasped as this movement is only an empty word. When its moments are grasped in their purity, they are the restless notions which only are in being themselves their own opposite, and in finding their rest in the whole. But the picture thinking of the religious community is not the speculative thinking. It has the content, but without its necessity, and instead of the form of the notion, it brings into the realm of pure consciousness the natural relationship of father and son. Since this consciousness, even in its thinking, remains at the level of picture thinking, absolute being is indeed revealed to it, but the moments of this being, on account of this empirically and synthetic presentation, partly themselves fall asunder so that they are not related to one another through their own notion, and partly this consciousness retreats from this its pure object, relating itself to it only in an external manner. The object is revealed to it by something alien, and it does not recognize itself in this thought of spirit, does not recognize the nature of pure self-consciousness, insofar as the form of picture thinking and of those relationships derived from nature must be transcended, and especially also the standpoint which takes the moments of the movement which spirit is, as isolated immovable substance or subjects. Instead of transient moments, the transcending of this standpoint is to be regarded as a compulsion on the part of the notion, as we pointed out earlier in connection with another aspect. But since this compulsion is instinctive, self-consciousness misunderstands its own nature, rejects the content as well as the form, and what amounts to the same thing, degrades the content into a historical pictorial idea and to an heirloom handed down by tradition. In this way, it is only the purely external element in belief that it is retained, and as something, therefore, that is dead and cannot be known. But the inner element in faith has vanished, because this would be the notion that knows itself as notion. Absolute spirit, as pictured in pure essence, is not indeed abstract pure essence, for abstract essence has sunk to the level of being merely an element, just because it is only a moment in the life of spirit. But the representation of spirit in this element is charged with the same defect of form which essence has, such as essence is an abstraction and is therefore the negation of its simple unitary nature as an other. Similarly, spirit is in the element of essence is the form of simple oneness, which therefore is equally essentially in an othering of itself, or what is the same thing, the relation of the eternal being to its being for self is the immediately simple one of pure thought. In this simple beholding of itself in the other, the otherness is therefore not posited as such. It is the difference which in pure thought is immediately no difference, a loving recognition in which the two sides, as regards their essence, do not stand as in an antithetical relation to each other. Spirit that is expressed in the element of pure thought is itself essentially this. No, pure thought is itself essentially this, yes. To be not merely in this element, but to be actual spirit, for in its notion lies otherness itself. That is the supersession of the pure notion that is only thought. The element of pure thought, because it is an abstract element, is itself rather the other of its simple unitary nature, and therefore passes over into the element proper to picture thinking, the element in which the moment of the pure notion obtain a substantial existence relatively to one another, and also are subjects which do not possess for a third the indifference towards each other of mere being, but being reflected into themselves, spontaneously part asunder and also place themselves over against each other. Thus, the merely eternal or abstract spirit becomes an other to itself, or enters into existence, and directly into immediate existence. Accordingly, it creates a world. This creating is picture thinking's word for the notion itself in its absolute movement, or to express the fact that the simple which has been asserted as absolute or pure thought, just because it is abstract, is rather the negative, and hence the self-opposed or other of itself, or because, to put the same thing in another form, that which is posited as essence is simple immediacy or being, but qua immediacy or being lacks self and therefore lacking inwardness is passive, or a being for another. This being for another is at the same time a world. Spirit in the determination of being for another is the inner subsistence of the moments formally enclosed within pure thought, is therefore the dissolution of their simple universality and their parting asunder of them into their own particularity. Resurrection of the flesh. But the world is not merely this spirit cast out and dispersed into the fullness of natural existence and its external ordering, for since spirit is essentially the simple self, this self is equally present in the world. It is the existent spirit, which is the individual self which has consciousness and distinguishes itself as other, or as world, from itself. This individual self, as at first is thus immediately posited, is not yet spirit for itself. It does not exist as spirit. It can be called innocent, but hardly good. Before it can in fact be self and spirit, it must first become another to its own self, just as the eternal being exhibits itself as the movement of being, self-identical in its otherness. Since the spirit is determined as at first an immediate existence, or as dispersed into the multifariousness of its consciousness, its othering of itself is the withdrawal into itself, or self-centeredness of knowing. As such, immediate existence suddenly turns into thought, or mere sense consciousness into consciousness of thought. And moreover, because the thought stems from immediacy, or is conditioned thought, it is not pure knowledge, but thought that is charged with otherness, and is therefore the self-opposed thought of good and evil. Man is pictorially thought of in this way, that it once happened without any necessity, that he lost the form of being at one with himself through plucking the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and was expelled from the state of innocence from nature, which yielded its fruits without toil, and from paradise, from the garden with its creatures. Since this withdrawal into itself, or self-centeredness, of the existent consciousness immediately makes it self-discordant, evil appears as the primary existence of the inwardly turned consciousness, and because the thoughts of good and evil are utterly opposed, and this antithesis is not yet resolved, this consciousness is essentially only evil. But at the same time, on account of just this antithesis, there is also present the good consciousness, opposing it, and their relation to each other, insofar as immediate existence suddenly changes into thought, and the being within self is, on the other hand, itself a thinking, while on the other hand, the moment of the othering of its essence is more precisely determined by it because of this double aspect. The becoming of evil can be shifted further back out of the existent world, even into the primary realm of thought. It can therefore be said that it is the very firstborn son of light, Lucifer himself, who fell because he withdrew into himself, or because self-centered, or became self-centered, but that in his place another was at once created. Such a form of expression as fallen, which, like the expression son, belongs moreover to picture thinking and not to the notion, degrades the moments of the notion to the level of picture thinking, or carries picture thinking over into the realm of thought. Likewise, it makes no difference if we coordinate a multiplicity of other shapes with the simple thought of otherness in the eternal being and transfer the self-consciousness into them. In fact, this coordination must be approved, since by means of it, this moment of otherness also expresses diversity as it should, and moreover, not as plurality in general, but also as a specific diversity, so that one part, the son, is that which is simple and knows itself to be essential being, while the other part is the alienation, the externalization of being for self, which lives only to praise that being to this part. Then can be assigned by the taking back again of the externalized being for self, and the withdrawal into self of the evil principle. Insofar as the otherness falls into two parts, spirit might, as regards its moments, if these are to be counted more exactly expressed, be more exactly expressed as a quaternity or in unity, or because the quantity itself again falls into two parts, namely one part which has remained good and the other which has become evil. Might even be expressed as a 5 in 1, but to count the moments can be reckoned as altogether useless, since in the first place what is differentiated is itself just as much only one thing, namely the thought of the difference, which is only one thought, as the differentiated is this differentiated element, the second relatively to the first, and secondly it is useless to count because the thought which grasps the many in a one must be dissolved out of its universality and differentiated into more than 3 or 4 distinct components, and this universality appears in contrast to the absolute determinateness of the abstract unit, the principle of number as indeterminateness with respect to number as such, so that we could speak only of numbers in general, that is, not of a specific number of differences. Here, therefore, it is quite superfluous to think of numbers and counting at all. Just as in other respects, the mere difference of quantity and amount has no notional significance and makes no difference. Good and evil were the specific differences yielded by the thought of spirit as immediately existent. Since their antithesis has not yet been resolved, and they are conceived of as the essence of thought, each of them having an independent existence of its own, man is a self lacking any essential being and is the synthetic ground of their existence and their conflict. But these universal powers just as much belong to the self, or the self is their actuality. In accordance with this moment, it therefore comes to pass that just as evil is nothing other than the self-centeredness of the natural existence of spirit, so conversely good enters into actuality and appears as an existent self-consciousness. That which is the pure thought of spirit is in general merely hinted at as the othering of the divine being. Here comes nearer to its realization for picture thinking. The realization consists of for picture thinking in the self-abasement of the divine being, who renounces his abstract and non-actual nature. Picture thinking takes the other aspect, evil, to be happening alien to the divine being, to grasp it in the divine being itself as the wrath of God. This demands from picture thinking, struggling against its limitations, its supreme and most strenuous effort, an effort which, since it lacks the notion, remains fruitless. The alienation of the divine being is thus made explicit in its twofold form. The self of spirit and its simple thought are the two moments whose absolute unity is spirit itself. Its alienation consists in the moments going apart from one another, and in one of them having an unequal value compared with the other. This disparity is therefore twofold, and two relationships arise, whose common moments are those just given. In one of them the divine being counts as essence, while natural existence and the self count as the unessential aspect which is to be superseded. In the other, on the contrary, being for self counts as the essential and the simple, divine being as unessential. Their still empty middle term is existence in general, the bare community of their two moments. This antithesis resolved not so much through the conflict between the two moments, which are pictured as separate and independent beings. Their very independence implies that each of them in its own self, through its notion, must resolve itself. The conflict begins where both cease to be these minglings of thought and of independent existence, and where they confront each other only as thoughts, for then they are as specific notions only in the relation of an antithesis. As independent, on the other hand, they have their essentiality outside of the antithesis. Their movement is therefore their own free and spontaneous movement, as then the movement of the two sides is an intrinsic movement. Since it is to be considered in the sides themselves, it is initiated by that side which is determined as possessing being in itself, as contrasted with the other. This is depicted as a spontaneous act, but the necessity for its externalization lies in the notion that being in itself, which is so determined in the antithesis, has just for that reason no genuine subsistence. It is therefore that side which has not being for self, but simple being, as its essence that alienates itself from itself, yields to death, and thereby reconciles absolute essence with itself, for in this movement it manifests itself as spirit. Abstract essence is alienated from itself. It has natural existence and self-like actuality. This, its otherness, or its sensuous presence, is taken back again by the second othering and posited as superseded, as universal. The absolute essence has thereby come to be its own self. In its sensuous presence, the immediate existence of actuality has ceased to be something alien and external for the absolute essence, since that existence is superseded, is universal. This death is therefore its resurrection as spirit. The transcendent immediate presence of the self-conscious essence has the form of universal self-consciousness. This notion of the transcendent individual self, that is absolute being, immediately expresses, therefore, the establishing of a community which, tarrying hitherto in the sphere of picture thinking, now returns into itself as the self, and in doing this, spirit passes over from the second element constituting it, that is, from picture thinking, into the third element, self-consciousness as such. If we further consider the behaviour of picture thinking in its progress, we find first of all the declaration that the divine being takes on human nature. Here it is already asserted that in themselves the two are not separate. Likewise, in the declaration that the divine being from the beginning externalizes itself, that its existence withdraws into itself and becomes self-centered and evil, implies, though it does not expressly assert, that this evil existence is not in itself something alien to the divine being. Absolute being would be but an empty name, if in truth there were for it an other. If there were a fall from it, on the contrary, the moment of being within self constitutes the essential moment of the self of spirit. That this being within self and the actuality which follows from it belongs to absolute being itself, this from us is notion, and insofar as it is notion, appears to the picture thinking consciousness as an incomprehensible happening. The inner self assumes for it the form of indifferent being. The Ascension of the Virgin. That, of course, will be Gala that is painted there. The thought that those moments of absolute being and of the self-centered self, which seem to flee from each other, are not separate, also appears in this picture thinking, for it does possess the true content, but this picture thought comes later in the externalization of the divine being, who is made flesh. The picture thought is in this way still immediate, and therefore not spiritual. That is, it knows the human form of the divine being at first only as a particular, and not yet as universal form. It becomes spiritual, for this consciousness in the movement, whereby this divine being in human shape sacrifices his immediate existence, again and returns to the divine being only when essence is reflected into itself, is its spirit in this picture thought, where there is depicted the reconciliation of the divine being with its other in general and specifically with the thought of it. evil. If this reconciliation is notionally expressed by saying that it consists in the fact that evil is in itself the same as goodness, or again that the divine being is the same as nature in its whole extent, or that nature separated from the divine being is simply nothing, we must regard this as an unspiritual way of talking, and one that is necessarily bound to give rise to misunderstandings. If evil is the same as goodness, then evil is just not evil, nor goodness good. On the contrary, both are suspended moments. Evil in general is self-centered being for self, and goodness is what is simple and without a self. When thus expressed in terms of their notion, their unity is at once evident, for self-centered being for self is simple knowing, and simple being that lacks a self is equally pure self-centered being for self. If, therefore, it must be said that according to this their notion good and evil, that is, insofar as they are not good and evil, are the same, it must also no less emphatically be asserted that they are not the same, but are utterly different. For simple being, for self, or pure knowing too, is each in its own self equally pure negativity or absolute difference. The whole is only complete when the two propositions are made together, and when the first is asserted and maintained, it must be countered by clinging to the other with invincible stubbornness. Since both are equally right, they are both equally wrong, and the mistake consists in taking such abstract forms as the same and not the same, identity and non-identity, to be something true, fixed and actual, and in resting on them neither the one nor the other as truth. The truth is just their movement, in which simple sameness in an abstraction and hence absolute difference, but this as difference in itself is distinguished from itself and is therefore self-sameness. This is precisely the case with the self-sameness of the divine being and nature in general and human nature in particular. The former is nature insofar as it is not essential being, and the latter is divine according to its essence. But it is spirit in which the truth of these two abstract sides is made explicit, namely by reducing them to suspended moments, an explication which cannot be expressed by the judgment on the lifeless is, which forms its copula. Similarly, nature is nothing apart from its essence, but this same nothing just as much it is an absolute abstraction, and thus pure thought or being within itself, and within the moment of its antithesis to the spiritual unity, it is evil. The difficulty that is found in these notions stems solely from clinging to the is and forgetting the thinking of the notion in which the moments just as much are as they are not, are only the movement which is spirit. It is this spiritual unity, or the unity in which the differences are present only as moments or as suspended, which has become explicit for the picture-thinking consciousness. In that reconciliation as spoken of above, and since this unity is the universality of self-consciousness has ceased to think in pictures, the movement has returned into self-consciousness. Spirit is thus posited in the third element, in universal self-consciousness. It is its community, the movement of the community as self-consciousness that has distinguished itself from its picture thought, is to make explicit what has been implicitly established. The dead divine man or human God is in himself the universal self-consciousness. This he has to become explicitly for this self-consciousness, or since this self-consciousness constitutes one side of the antithesis in picture thought, namely the side of evil, for which natural existence, the individual self-consciousness count as essence, this side which is pictured as independent, not yet as a moment, has on account of its independence to raise itself through its own nature to spirit, that is, it has to exhibit in its own self the movement of spirit. This self-consciousness is natural spirit. The self has to withdraw from this natural existence and retreat into itself, which would mean to become evil. But this side is already in itself evil. Its withdrawal into itself consists, therefore, in convincing itself that natural existence is evil. For the consciousness that thinks in pictures, the world has actually become evil and is evil, and the propitiation of the absolute being was a real event. But in self-consciousness as such, what is thus pictured as happening as an event has as regards its form the significance only of a suspended moment, for the self is the negative and hence a knowing that is a pure act within consciousness itself. This moment of the negative must likewise express itself in the content. That is to say, since absolute being is already reconciled with itself in itself, and is a spiritual unity in which the parts of the picture thought are suspended or are moments, what is expressed in the content is that each part of the picture thought here receives the opposite meaning to what it had before. Each meaning thereby completes itself in the other, and only through this self-completion is the content a spiritual one, since the determination is just as much its opposite. Unity in otherness. That is, the spiritual relationship is an accomplished fact, just as the opposite meanings were united previously for us, or in themselves, and even the abstract form of the same and not the same, of identity and non-identity, were reduced to moments. If then, in the picture thinking, consciousness, the inwardizing of natural self-consciousness, was the real existence of evil, that inwardizing is in the element of self-consciousness is the knowledge of evil as something that is implicit in existence. This knowledge is, of course, a genesis of evil, but only a genesis of the thought of evil, and is therefore recognized as the first moment of reconciliation. For as the withdrawal into itself from the immediacy of nature, which is determined as evil, it is a forsaking of that immediacy and a dying away of sin. It is not natural existence as such that is forsaken by consciousness, but natural existence that is at the same time known as evil. The immediate movement of withdrawal into self is just as much an mediated movement. It presupposes itself or is its own ground. That is to say, the ground of the withdrawal into self is that nature has already withdrawn into itself on account of evil. Man must withdraw into himself, but evil is itself the withdrawal into self. The first movement is for that very reason only immediate, or the simple notion of that movement, because it is the same as what its ground is. The movement or othering has therefore still to appear, but in its own more characteristic form. Untitled, painting by Dali, but it might be of the resurrection. After Michelangelo, I think, I'm not sure. Anyway. Besides this immediacy, therefore, the mediation of the picture thought is necessary. The knowledge of nature as the untrue existence of spirit, and this immanently developed universality of the self is in itself the reconciliation of spirit with itself. For the self-consciousness that does not think in terms of the notion, this in itself receives the form of something that possesses immediate being and is imaginatively represented. Comprehension is therefore for that self-consciousness not a grasping of this notion, which knows superseded natural existence to be universal and therefore reconciled with itself, but rather a grasping of the imaginative idea that by bringing to pass its own externalization in its historical incarnation and death, the divine being has been reconciled with its natural existence. The grasping of this idea now expresses more definitely what was previously called the spiritual resurrection in the same context, that is, the coming into existence of God's individual self-consciousness as a universal self-consciousness or as the religious community. The death of the divine man, as death, is abstract negativity. The immediate result of the movement, which ends only in natural universality, a death loses its natural meaning in spiritual self-consciousness, that is, comes to be its just stated notion. Death becomes transfigured from its immediate meaning, namely, the non-being of this particular individual, into the universality of the spirit who dwells in his community, dies in it every day, and is daily resurrected. Thus, what belongs to the element of picture thinking, namely the absolute spirit qua individual, or rather qua particular spirit, presents the nature of spirit in its natural existence, is here shifted into self-consciousness itself, into knowledge that preserves itself in its otherness. This self-consciousness, therefore, does not actually die, as the particular self consciousness is pictured as being actually dead, but its particularity dies away in its universality. That is, in its knowledge, which is essential being reconciling itself with itself. The immediately preceding element of picture thinking is therefore here explicitly set aside, or it has returned into the self and into its notion, which was in the former merely in the element of being has become a subject. By this very fact, the first element too, pure thinking and the eternal spirit therein, is no longer beyond the picturing consciousness or beyond the self. On the contrary, the return into itself of the whole is just this, to contain within itself all the moments. The death of the mediator, as grasped by the self, is the supersession of his objective existence, or his particular being for self. This particular being for self has become a universal self-consciousness. On the other side, the universal has become self-consciousness just because of this, and the pure or non-actual spirit of mere thinking has become actual. The death of the mediator is the death not only of his natural aspect, or of his particular being for self, not only of the already dead husk stripped of its essential being, but also of the abstraction of the divine being. For the mediator, insofar as his death has not yet completed the reconciliation, is the one-sidedness which takes as essential being the simple element of thought. In contrast to actuality, this one-sided extreme of the self does not as yet have equal worth with essential being. This at first has as spirit. The death of this picture thought contains therefore at the same time the death of the abstraction of the divine being, which is not posited as self. That death is the painful feeling of the unhappy consciousness that God himself is dead. This hard saying is the expression of innermost simple self-knowledge, the return of consciousness into the depths of the night, in which I equals I, a night which no longer distinguishes or knows anything as outside of it. The feeling is in fact the loss of substance and of its appearance over against consciousness, but it is at the same time the pure subjectivity of substance, or the pure certainty of itself, which it lacked when it was object, or the immediate or pure essence. This knowing is the inbreathing of the spirit, whereby substance becomes subject, by which its abstraction and lifelessness have died, and substance therefore has become actual and simple and universal self-consciousness. In the same way, therefore, spirit is self-knowing spirit. It knows itself. That which is object for it is, or its picture thought, is the true absolute content. As we saw, it expressed spirit itself. It has at the same time not merely the content of self-consciousness, and not merely object for it, but it is also actual spirit. This it is because it runs through the three elements of its nature. The movement through its own phases constitutes its actuality. What moves itself, that is spirit, it is the subject of the movement, and is equally the moving itself, or the substance through which the subject moves. The notion of spirit, which has submerged for us as we entered into the sphere of religion, namely as the movement of self-certain spirit, which forgives evil and in so doing abandons its own simple unitary nature and rigid unchangeableness, or as the movement in which what is an absolute antithesis recognizes itself as the same as its opposite. This recognition bursting forth as the affirmative between these extremes, this notion is intuitively apprehended by the religious consciousness, to which the absolute being is revealed, and which overcomes the difference between itself and what it intuitively apprehends. Just as it is subject, so also it is substance, and hence it is itself spirit, just because and in it so far as it is this movement. But the community is not yet perfected in this its self-consciousness in general. Its context exists for it in the form of picture thinking, and the duality of this thinking still attaches even to the actual spirituality of the community, to its return out of the picture thinking, just as the element of pure thought itself was burdened with it. The community also does not possess the consciousness of what it is. It is spiritual self-consciousness, which is not an object itself to itself, as this self-consciousness, or which does not unfold itself to a consciousness of itself, but rather insofar as it is consciousness, it has those picture thoughts which we have considered. We see self-consciousness as its last turning point, becomes inward to itself, and attain to a knowledge of its inwardness, we see it divest itself of its natural existence and acquire pure negativity. But the positive meaning, namely that this negativity or pure inwardness of knowledge is just as much the self-identical essence, or in other words, that substance has here succeeded in becoming absolute self-consciousness. This is an other for the devotional consciousness. It grasps this aspect, namely that the pure inwardization of knowledge is in itself absolute simplicity or substance, as the picture thought of something which is so, not in virtue of its notion, but as the deed of an alien, a satisfaction. In other words, it does not grasp the fact that this depth of the pure self is the power by which the abstract divine being is drawn down from its abstraction and raised to a self by the power of this pure devotion. The action of the self retains towards it this negativity, this negative meaning, because the externalization, the kenosis of substance, is taken by the self to be an action implicit in the nature of substance. The self does not grasp and truly comprehend it, or does not find it in its own action as such. This unity of essence and the self having been implicitly achieved, consciousness too still has this picture thought of its reconciliation, but as a picture thought. It obtains satisfaction by externally attaching to its pure negativity the positive meaning of the unity of itself with the essential being. Its satisfaction thus itself remains burdened with the antithesis of a beyond. Its own reconciliation therefore enters its consciousness as something distant, as something in the distant future. Just as the reconciliation which the other self achieved appears as something in the distant past, just as the individual divine man has a father in principle and only an actual mother, so too the universal divine man, the community, has for its father its own doing and knowing, but for its mother eternal love, which it only feels and does not behold in its consciousness, is an actual immediate object. Its reconciliation therefore is in its heart, but its consciousness is still divided against itself, and its actual world is still disrupted. What enters its consciousness as in itself, or the side of pure mediation, is a reconciliation that lies in the beyond, but what enters it as present, as the side of immediacy and existence, is the world which has still to await its transfiguration. The world is indeed implicitly reconciled with the divine being, and regarding the divine being, it is known, of course, that it recognizes the object is no longer alienated from it, but as identical with it in its love. But for self-consciousness, this immediate presence still has not the shape of spirit. The spirit of the community is thus in its immediate consciousness divided from its religious consciousness, which declares it is true that in themselves they are not divided, but this merely implicit unity is not realized or has not yet become an equally absolute being for self. And so Christ ascends to heaven.